Hello. I made it just on time. My cat is currently racing around the house, so he's not going to come over and say hi right now. He's got the zoomies. I know you all love the cat. Everybody loves the cat. It's a little bit cold where I'm at this morning, so I'm wearing arm sleeves because they're fun. I love them. They're super tall, see? They go above my elbow. Alright, well, hopefully everybody was able to join. I know this is a different time than normal, but it's a Saturday, so I didn't really want to do it Saturday night. Figured people might be busy. Welcome. Thanks for tuning in. If you were able to make it to the other classes, welcome back. If this is your first one, welcome for the first time. I've got the recordings posted for the other two classes. The first one is on Facebook in the event for this class, and then the second one is uploaded to YouTube. I'm still trying to get the first one uploaded to YouTube. Hasn't worked so far, but I'm hopeful eventually that it will. So, any questions from the last class or the last classes that you want to ask before we get started? Especially for those who weren't able to watch them live. No? Alright, we'll get started. Got a lot to cover, so hopefully this will only be an hour, but we'll see. I'll do my best. Alright, so just as a quick reminder, and for anybody new, this is what we're making. It's an Islamic style book, made using medieval Islamic techniques, although not exactly materials, but you could make it out of Islamic style materials if you wanted to. I just didn't because they're expensive. Alright, so today is all about finishing the book. So this is what it will look like-ish when we're finished. This is where we left off at our last class. So the cover boards have been attached, the end bands have been sewn, all of that fun stuff. And I took out the marker that denoted which side was front and which was back. I think this is front. So you can tell this is front because there's a little bit of extra gap in between the cover board and the text block because you need to leave space for the envelope flap, which is this piece, to fit in there without warping the cover too badly. Alright, so for our cover today, I'm using a nice pretty quilting cotton that I have layered on the back side with, I forget what it's called, rice paper is what it's called. I don't know that it's actually made of rice, but that's what it's called. Works great for this. And at the end, hopefully I will have time to show you how to make it. If not, I will do a bonus class, a shorter bonus class on how to make this. But, so what I've done is I've marked out where I want my book to go, based on the designs on the front side, really. If you use, mulberry paper, yes, thank you, that's what it's actually called. It's nice having people in the class who know what I'm talking about so that when I forget the words, they can fill in for me. Thank you. So, I've marked out where I want it to go. Basically, kind of laid it over the front, lined up the designs I wanted, and kind of did this folding over the side thing to try and figure out where it actually goes. Oh, I'm trying a new camera setup so you'll be able to see the book press, but there we go, that's a little better. So you'll be able to see the book press when I get to that step, but we're gonna see if this new setup works at all. All right. So, attaching the cover is really pretty easy. My favorite finger glue again. Actually gonna free my hands a little bit. So I whipped up a fresh batch of this stuff this morning. So you basically just take a glop and start smearing it on the cover boards. You could smear it on the cover instead, but I find it's easier because the cover boards are more rigid and they have the exact size that they're going to be. Because tracing this line here is totally optional. You don't have to do that, so it's easier for this. Also, if you're using a more period-appropriate material, such as silk velvet, smearing this stuff on silk velvet is really difficult because I've tried that. So smearing it on the cover boards works way better. Oh, and a note. So pencil works fine for marking on this stuff. If you're marking on a dark fabric directly, they make mechanical chalk pencils. Oh, right, this one. That are super cool. I find them very helpful. So smear, smear, smear. Also, if I start going too fast, oh, do I back the silk velvet? No, I don't. I tested it, and from what I could tell, I don't need to. So I will actually show you the reason that I back the cotton fabric. And I lost a piece. We're gonna see how well this shows up in the camera. Let's try this camera. So you see that like glossy stuff on the fabric itself. So normally it just kind of looks fine, but there's a patch over here that's glossy. That's where the glue got through. So if I had done this without the backing and just put this on the book, I would have had to worry about it sticking to the press itself, which would not have been great. So I'll show you the way you make it. It's really pretty easy, but it helps take care of all of that ahead of time. So the glue won't get through this mulberry paper because it's a finer weave and it can get through the cotton. So you glue it first in a way that you can peel it off of the substrate really easily so that you don't have to worry about the gluing your book to the press. Yeah, the mulberry paper. I packed it. It's called mulberry paper. Sometimes it's sold as rice paper. So the stuff I use actually says rice paper on the label. I'll show you in a little bit if we get to that section of today's class. If I go too fast, let me know. Like I said, we've got a lot to cover today, and I'm trying to stay within an hour, so I'm going a little quickly. All right. Smear it. Try not to have any like major large lumps just because they look funny and it's going to squirt glue where you don't expect it. So I've applied glue. I don't think you can see it really well, but I have applied glue to the whole of the cover board, I promise. And then I take it and then I line it up with the lines I made earlier, and then I press down. And then I just sort of sit here and hold it for a second while I take a drink of water. And then I flip it over and I take my brayer and I just sort of smooth it out, make sure that all the little tiny lumps of glue that I didn't quite get smoothed out are now smoothed out and won't be gluey and lumpy and stuff. All right, hold on a second. It's allergy season. It's terrible. Okay, and then, so the first time I made one of these, I actually did the gluing of the cover in sections. So like I did this part and then pressed it and let it dry, and then I did the next part, pressed it, let it dry, did the next part. You don't need to do that. I was testing it for the first time, and I wasn't sure how much it would slip around while I was working on it. So I've discovered it doesn't really slip much as long as you're careful. But if it's more comfortable for you the first time you make it, feel free to do the same thing. All right, and then we glue the spine. So that's what I'm doing now. Here, let me flip it this way so you can kind of see. So I'm just rubbing glue along the spine. And I'm not being super careful about getting it on the cover or not or whatever, because the whole thing's gonna get glued by the time we're done. All right, and then I make sure to put a little bit extra where the threads for the primary end band tie down are, because I want them to get extra glued so that they don't fray eventually if the book gets a little bit damaged. All right, okay. And then technically I do the spine and the back cover kind of all in one now. So, smear, smear, smear. So how is everybody doing this lovely Saturday morning? At least it's morning where I am, and it's probably morning where some of you are. Oh, yeah, in case I forget to mention, for anybody who's new, you can ask questions in the chat. If you don't have an account and therefore can't put stuff in the chat, you're welcome to email me. I will give you my email at the end. I also have a blog. One of my posts is basically the text and picture version of this video series, so you're welcome to put questions in there, and it may have more answers. Ooh, Turkish coffee. I love Turkish coffee. It's my favorite kind. There's. When you're gluing, keep a paper towel or something nearby so you can clean your fingers off. It's very helpful. Okay, so I've got the spine and the back cover glued, so now I just sort of kind of roll it over. Make sure that it's tight across the spine and across the back. And then I kind of make sure that the spine is actually, oops, I got my fingers on glue. I make sure that the spine is actually kind of taut across it. So I forget if European bookbindings did this or not, but you do actually glue the cover to the spine. Modern hardback covers you don't quite do the same way, so they're called hollowback, because if you were to open them, actually, I can demonstrate because I have a book. Maybe. Okay. So if you were to open a modern hardback, there'd be a little bit of a space here. It's kind of hard to see because of the lip, but there is a tiny bit of space between the outer spine of the book and the spine of the text block, so that's called a hollowback. Oh, this is hemp paper. I don't know how well you can see it, but this is the most period kind of paper that you can still buy today. Ooh, laureled for coffee. You and I should talk more. That sounds awesome. I'm making a Turkish coffee cordial currently. Hollowback bindings period. I think hollowback bindings might be period for Europe. Like I said, I'm not at all an expert on European book bindings. I found a couple of sources to learn more about it, but haven't had a chance to read them yet. Yes, I will be posting a blog post on the cordials that I'm making eventually. I run into that problem where I can either do things or write about the things I'm doing, and I generally choose to do things. White wine out of green coffee beans. That sounds awesome. All right, hold on a minute. Speaking of coffee, I actually want tea. That was why I was running a little late this morning. I realized I hadn't made tea yet. That's very sad. All right, so anyway, we have now glued the cover onto the book. I usually stop at this point and press it, and then move on to gluing the foredge flap and the envelope flap. So that's what we're gonna do, but you could technically do it all in one go. So I'm putting the book in the press. I will press it down later because we got a couple of books that we're gonna press today. So yeah, the downside of doing stay little camera. The downside of doing this workshop version is that we'd wind up having like 3 very short classes at the end while you wait for glue to dry. I may have slightly overfilled my teacup. That'll be fun. I super overfilled my teacup. Whoops. It's a Saturday morning. I'm struggling. Just gonna mop that up as best I can and deal with it later. Okay, this is gonna be fun. All right. Okay, cool. Yeah, like I said, we've got somebody else here who knows kind of what they're doing, so please do feel free to chime in with answers. I appreciate it. While I try and deal with the mess I just made with my tea. You made a giant mess with my tea. Alright, I'm gonna have to go get more paper towels. I will be right back. I apologize. But feel free to ask any questions you have, and I will answer them when I get back in just a second. And I apologize because class will probably go slightly late because I spilled my tea all over the place. Okay, so moving on. Alright, so this is a book that's in the same stage as the other book was. Where I've already glued the cover, the spine, and it's had a chance to dry. So that's where we're at. So next, we've got the foredge flap. So you can either support it with basically the same material as the cover, or you can do an unsupported foredge flap. Generally for like leather, which is pretty thick, you wouldn't need to support it, but this material is quite thin. So I go ahead and do the support. For a book this small, honestly, you could get away without a support. It would just mean that the flap part that covers the, so this is called the foredge of the book, head, tail, spine. There's your terminology lesson for today. So the flap just sort of protects the edges of the pages from dust and dirt and everything else. And then the envelope flap helps with that as well. So the envelope flap will end up here when we're done. So you can do it without the support. I tend to do the support mostly for practice. For when I do, eventually I want to do a larger book and it'll need it. So I've already gone ahead and measured out and cut a piece of the cover board material to the dimensions of the text block. You can either measure the text block or like lay a slightly larger piece over and then kind of trace with a pencil and then cut it, or I actually find it's useful to just, because the dimensions will be the same, to do it on one edge instead. So to glue this, again, you kind of apply the glue to the cover board. If you loved finger painting as a kid, you will love working with this glue. Or if you think finger painting isn't only for kids, then you will love working with this glue. And then clear the glue off your fingers. And then I take a scrap piece of the cover board. So basically what you're going to do is, when this is all said and done, you're only covering the paper part, which means you've got a couple of boards there, board widths there, that you need to not be covering. You need to offset from. So I take a scrap piece. No, that's not the scrap piece. Whoops. I take a scrap piece of cover board and I place it up against the cover. And then I place my foredge flap, glue side down, against that scrap piece so that I've got it the correct offset, so that when I close it, it will line up with the pages and not with the cover boards. And then I remove my scrap piece. So you can sort of see there's a gap there. It's not a very wide gap. If you use a thicker cover board material, then it will be a wider gap. And then I'm going to do the same thing with the envelope flap. I'm not really sure why envelope flaps developed in the Islamic tradition and not the European tradition, given that, you know, Europe would also need to protect its books, the edges of its books, from like dust and stuff. But I think it's because in the Islamic tradition the cover boards are the same size as the text block, whereas in European tradition the cover boards are a little bit bigger. So that kind of helps protect them a little bit that way. So what I'm talking about is you can clearly see the cover boards are larger than the text block, whereas when we're done with this book, here you can see on the sample book, they're really not. There's a tiny bit of overlap because I can never cut things perfectly, but there's not intended to be. So in the European books, that little offset air gap helps protect them, whereas in the Islamic, they don't have that. So they added an envelope flap. I'm not sure which one works better, honestly. It may just depend on the conditions of the place you're in. All right, and then I do the same little gappy offset thing again. And hopefully you guys can see this reasonably well. My camera keeps getting bumped. And then I just line this up. No, come here. So then I just line this up. And the other thing that you want to do is you want to make sure that the head and tail are lined up as well. One way you can do that is just kind of draw a line before you glue these down. So you can use a scrap piece, line it up with an edge, and then draw a line across so you know where top and bottom are. I've honestly gotten to the point where I can eyeball it pretty well. All right, press them down. Take your little brayer. You don't have to have the brayer. The brayer is optional. I find it's useful and helpful, and I had it, so I may as well use it. The bone folder also works pretty well for this. Okay. Then, there's my long. You're not my long one. There's my long one. All right, parchment paper. So I've got another piece of parchment paper. I just sort of line it up, fold that closed, open that, fold these over carefully, close that, and that's that for that. How do you get the angle for the flap? Oh, okay. I will get to that one in a minute. Thank you for reminding me. I forgot to remember that. All right, set that there. Okay, so I've made so many of these books that I've actually just started tracing out. So whenever I cut one, before I glue it, I will trace it onto a template for the next one. But really, you just kind of eyeball it. So the width of the flap, this is not a great, here. The width of the flap should be roughly a third the width of the text block-ish. And then I just sort of eyeball it. I think then the other thing I had like you can see where I traced out a couple different, you can see where I was tracing out a couple different angles, decided which one I liked. So you just kind of play around with it, find an angle you like. But it does need, there's a flat part here, so it's not angled all the way back to the corner. This is, I tend to do so that the angle itself is pretty shallow, but that's to some degree personal preference. They generally didn't do super steep angles, but a lot of the times it's just kind of eyeball it. So I'll measure out a third, I'll measure out some amount down here that looks right, and then I'll mark a halfway point and then just draw lines between them. Generally how I do that part. All right, so we've got that. So we're up to trimming. So once all that dries, you're gonna wind up with a book that's gonna look, well, you're gonna have all that extra fabric still around the edges. So what I do is, for this size mat board and this size book, I generally do 3/8 to 1/2 of an inch extra. But you basically want enough so you can fold it over the board and come in just a little bit. You don't want it like all the way out to here. You don't want it just barely covering. So I find this is a pretty good distance for this size book and mat board. If you're doing a really big book, you might want it a little bit bigger, just proportionally. But this kind of works. So what you'll do for that is lay the book out kind of, I use a quilter square because I have one, but you can use just a ruler is fine, or eyeball it. It doesn't have to be exact or perfect. So then you just sort of trace around in a square or rectangle, and then clip the corners. That's the easier way to see it. So clip the corners such that when you fold them in, they as closely as possible line up with each other on a 45. So this one actually overlaps just a little bit. You can see that. Let's see how well I did on this one. This one's a little better. The idea is that they would perfectly meet. For a cover as thin as this cotton cover, it really doesn't matter that much. But if you're using a silk velvet or a leather cover, you do not want a whole lot of extra bulk here at this corner. So you want to try and make sure that they just perfectly meet. This one's trickier, so I already did this one because I'm demonstrating multiple things on one little book. But for this one, I end up just clipping straight out perpendicular from the center point and then folding over and doing my best to kind of finagle how to get them to perfectly meet. The actual 90-degree corners are way easier. For the spine, I do something similar to the point of the envelope flap. I clip basically perpendicular on either side of the spine here, and then clip at a slight angle so that when I fold in, actually I didn't do a super great job on these ones. I cut them a little too wide. But the idea being that when you fold in, you're not like abutting up to the text block. I did a little better on this one. So there's just a tiny little bit of gap here between the text block and the end of the lining, and that's just to help it fold better. Okay, so I can take my note off. Okay, so once you've cut it and trimmed it and you're satisfied with that, the next thing to do is to turn it in and glue it. So again, finger paint glue. This time I do apply it directly to the cover because again, that's the thing that determines where it's going. So you could do it to the cover boards, but then you'd have to guess exactly where it's gonna end and you may end up with extra glue and it's just not optimal. And then press it over. And I hold it for a couple of seconds to help the glue grab hold. The nice thing about this glue is that it will pretty much grab hold pretty well and not just immediately come back up. So we do this to all three. All right, well, I'm doing this. Questions so far? Am I going too fast? I could try and slow down. The extra book cloth at the spine. Did I answer? Oh, so the extra book cloth at the spine will get folded under. I've already done that on this one, but I can undo it and show you the process, I think. I don't think I glued it down yet. So I tend to glue it once I folded it just to help it stay folded, but I don't know that that's a period technique. Oh, for those who are not familiar, when I say period, I'm referring to the medieval period. I'm a member of the Society for Creative Anachronism, or the SCA. If you're interested in learning more about what that is, I can point you to somebody, but it's a medieval recreation society. We do things like figuring out how people did stuff in the medieval period, and then we recreate it for fun. The whole like plague thing is not something we usually recreate, but it is totally appropriate to the medieval period. Alright. As is the word quarantine, fun fact. It's from the Italian, and it was from the time of the Black Plague, apparently, because they used to quarantine incoming ships for 40 days to make sure they were plague-free before they'd let them in. Sadly, our quarantine is lasting longer than 40 days. So, and then once you've applied the glue, you just, again, fold it over. If any of your corners are popping up because you didn't put quite enough glue there, just put a little extra dab. Press it down. And then clean my fingers again. And then I take the bone folder, put it in here, and kind of smooth it out, get any extra glue that doesn't need to be there out, because I always tend to put a little bit too much on, which is fine. Better to have a little too much and smear it out than not enough and have it not stick when you're done. So, I don't know if you can see, but I got like little globs of glue where I put too much in, and then you just take your handy dandy paper towel and clean it off. like that. Welcome to the modern Middle Ages, where we take all of the things we love about history and experience them today, except with indoor plumbing. Yep, unless you're at an event, and then maybe indoor plumbing. All right, and then another piece of the ever useful parchment paper, and we just fold it over. So normally I would do both sets of turn-ins at the same time and then put it back in the press and let it dry, but I only made so many little sample books to walk you through the process, so we're doing a double dose on this one. All right, hold on, tea. Because I need my caffeine boost. All right, so back to the extra book cloth at the spine. Let me see. Are you gonna come out for me? Maybe? I probably should have left one of these out so I could demonstrate putting it in for you guys, but I didn't. No, it's not. I must have already glued it. So you can kind of see where I've folded. So in general, you'll have, you know, excess book cloth poking up here. Again, cut a slight angle to make it a little easier. Thank you. TARDIS mug is the best mug. So you cut just a slight angle to make it basically pointy, almost pointy, and then just sort of shove it down in this extra space. And then I put a little bit of glue in. Depending on how well you've glued your cover to your spine, there may not be any gap there, or not much of one, so you can trim that extra material short before you fold it in. But yeah, I'll try and remember that for next time I teach a class like this, to leave one of these out so I can demonstrate. Okay, so once that side's dried, it'll look kind of like this side. And the next step for this is to apply the doublures. As I mentioned last time, these are known by a number of different names. Paste downs, end pages, I'm sure I've heard other ones. According to European tradition, they're only called doublures when they're leather, but the favorite book for learning how to do this stuff calls them all doublures, so that's what I've been calling them. That's the first book I found for learning how to do Islamic style book bindings, so that's my primary reference. Hi, Captain. No, you can't come say hi. I'm sorry. All right, where did I put? There it is. Okay, so I tend to do doublures of the same paper that I used for the text block. That's optional. A lot of the time, so in my favorite book for this, there is actually, she does a study of what kinds of materials were used for different things. A lot of the time it was just plain paper, so plain being the same kind as you used for the book. Sometimes it was colored paper, sometimes it was marbled paper. I don't know if marbling originated in the Islamic lands, but it got there pretty quick. So they used it a lot, and then I guess it moved from there to Italy to the rest of Europe. So it is more common these days, so you can acquire marbled paper. The other fun paper that I've found recently that I'm using for another book I'm making is this handmade paper from, I think it's Nepal, but like it comes in a whole bunch of different designs. It generally comes in giant sheets. So if you're buying like the hemp paper or other pretty or fine art paper, it will come in these giant sheets. And then you have to trim it down to make a book because you don't want to do giant sheets. You could technically just fold and fold and fold. So originally gatherings might have been called, oops, I keep kicking the tripod, might have been called bifolios, or I think it's quadfolios, or I forget the other ones, but it's basically how many times the page was folded before it was used in the book. I find folding that much difficult because it tends to not make nice pretty creases, so I just cut it first and then fold it in just half. But anyway, so you can use nice pretty paper like that. If you do, you gotta watch out for the possibility that it's gonna stain your first page. So sometimes what they would do is they would put in an extra sheet before like the beginning of the book. So that's why in hardback books you'll often find like there's a blank sheet before the title page. It was to help protect from any color leakage from the pretty papers. And they still do it mostly because it's tradition at this point. So anyway, for the doubleurs, I'm showing you on this part because it's the more difficult part. The other side is really super easy. It's just rectangles. But this one's got the fun little point for the envelope flap. Do you need to do anything for the portion of the cover material that is folded over the flap, since there is that space we left in to allow it to fold properly? I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand your question. I think I get it. For the front side. No, you just treat it the same as you would. So there's a tiny bit of an extra gap. It's usually not that thick, but no, it's fine. It'll get covered with the doubleurs regardless. Does that make sense? Does that answer what the question was? All right, well, let me know and I will continue moving on for the moment. So the way I do this is I line it up. So there's options for kind of this part of the doubleur. This part's just going to get pasted down up to where it joins the text block. You can either trim it at that point. You can leave a little stub, so you would trim it like here and leave this short little stub that you would paste onto the outside of the text block, or you can leave the whole page. In the other side. Over on here, figure out a clear way to ask. No worries. It's Saturday morning. I'm not completely awake yet. I haven't had my caffeine, as evidenced by the fact that I'm drinking my caffeine currently. All right, so you're gonna line it up here. So normally it's just gonna look like a rectangle like this. The way I found is easiest to do it is to line it up parallel with the text block and then kind of fold the paper over, play around with it until it lines up. The goal here is that you should see just a little bit of the cover material before you reach the doubleur. So not very much, just a thin little strip of cover material outside of the doubleur. All right, so like I said, you just fold it down and then I cut it. Sometimes I use a rolling cutter. Currently I'm just going to use scissors. The rolling cutter tends to make a cleaner edge, but it also requires me to move all this stuff off my workspace so I can get to the cutting mat. There we go. Scissors worked fine. Okay. And then, again, the way I do it, which you can do it the other way as you want, is I glue on to the cover boards. You could glue onto the doubleur if you wanted. And then I just kind of get close to the edge with the glue, since I know kind of about where it should stop because I was just using the paper to measure where it's going. So I have an idea for how far out to put the glue. So there's a couple ways of doing this if you're doing it with paper. So the different materials they would use. Leather is common when combined with leather bindings. I'm going to just continue explaining and hopefully this will answer your question. If it doesn't, re-ask it at the end so that I know I didn't answer your question. So leather was common when used with leather covers. Cloth could also have been used, but paper, generally plain paper, was the most common according to the research done by the author of the book. So I generally do paper. There is a downside to paper, and that is that where these folds are, the paper tends to like crinkle. It doesn't really it's not super flexible, so it tends to do funny crinkly things. I'm sure there's a way to make it not do that. I just haven't figured out the trick yet. There is an option to help kind of prevent that, and that is to glue the doubleur on these individual sections individually, and leave a gap, and leave these gaps here alone, and then you would go back in and cover over those gaps with leather or fabric. I haven't experimented with that yet. It is on the list of things to try. I'm hoping that it will work because the thicker the paper that you use for the doublure, the worse that little creasy thing that happens is. And I'm doing a book soon with a much thicker art paper that also the pretty fancy paper I got. I intend to use some of that for doublures, and it's thicker, so it's going to run into that problem. So I'm going to try doing the covering the joints with fabric or leather, because that's got more flexibility and give to it. I have unfortunately not found too much research in terms of like how they did it to prevent it from creasing when they did it with paper. Leather and fabric, it wouldn't be as big of an issue because they tend to be more flexible. Gluing takes a little while. So much glue. Alright, things generally make... Oh, we got a question. I would use the bone folder to work the paper into the... Yep, I did that. I've done that, and it only helped somewhat. But again, there may be a better technique that I just haven't quite figured out yet. I've unfortunately had to more or less teach myself all of this. I haven't found anybody else yet that does kind of this stuff in the Islamic style. But another option you have, if you don't want to have to worry about any of that, is to just not do the 4-edge flap and the envelope flap. I've done a couple of books where the binding is done Islamic style, but I left off the flaps because I didn't need them for that particular book. That is entirely up to you. That's the creative part of, creative anachronism. You can do what you want. Okay, so got the glue applied. Now comes the super fun part. For this one, actually for all of them, I tend to work from the outside. Oops, I didn't quite get enough glue down there at the edge. The other nice thing about this cloth is that you can very clearly see where you have gotten glue and where you haven't, because it darkens just a little bit from the moisture in the glue. Okay, so I tend to start at this end, kind of line it up as best I can. You can move stuff around a little bit as you go, but not tons, I've found, at least not with printer paper. So put it on, smooth it out. You can use the brayer or the bone folder for this. And just sort of work your way in towards the spine. Probably part of the problem I'm having with the whole scrunchy thing is that it has a tendency to fall onto the page earlier than I wanted it to. So, trying to control the paper. Again, that whole thing where like bookbinders need 4 hands. Because the book moves and the paper moves and does funny things with the glue. And you're trying to get smooth here, so any like random little bumps of glue, trying to smooth those out as you go. That is the downside I found to wheat starch glue, is that it tends to be a little bit lumpy. So it causes problems with tiny little bumps, because it will never entirely smooth out. Alright. So you work out all the way back to the spine. And kind of, I view this as when you kind of make the decision if you want to just trim it back. So like I said, you can trim it so that it is flush with the spine, in which case you would trim it basically right there. You can make a little stub, in which case you trim it like right about there. Or you can take it all the way to the end of the text block, in which case I wait until it dries and then I cut it so that it is flush with the rest of the pages. I don't know how well you can see, but it's already, there's bumps and lumps and stuff, because it never wants to smooth out quite nicely. I'm sure that, a master artisan who's been doing this for 20 years would probably do it better, but I'm still very much an apprentice at this. Okay, so If you're gonna do cutting it here or pasting a stub, I would usually stop gluing at this point, and then wait for this to dry and then cut the page and then apply whatever extra glue you need to for doing the stub. If you're doing the extending it the full width of the text block, then there's what's called tipping. Tipping's more used in like book repair. So I fold it over to form the crease here so I know where the end of the text block is. But they did use it to add in like extra pages if needed. And it's basically you take a little bit of glue and you apply it right in a thin line along the edge of the spine. And when I say thin, I mean like a millimeter or so off the spine. It really doesn't need to be much. It doesn't matter if it's a little bit more, the page just may or may not open quite exactly nicely. The thinner you manage to get the glue along the spine while still getting enough of it there to hold the page, then the better it opens, really. All right. And then fold this over like that. And then I got used to using parchment paper for everything when I did book repair. So just to make sure that if any glue seeps out, it doesn't accidentally glue the book closed in funny ways, I put parchment paper in between the part I'm gluing and the part I'm not gluing. And then you fold this over because I want this to dry with the paper in the creased folded position, because otherwise if it dries flat, it's not gonna fold very well. And then you take this and you put it in the book press with the rest. All right, and since that's the last thing that's going in the press for right now, there's the press. We'll see how well this is gonna stay still. You know what? Just take it off the stand. Okay, so you can see the books in the press. The way I built my press, I actually have to have a slight offset board because I've got this thickness here. So the book that I'm pressing has to be at least this thick, or I have to use an offset board. These books aren't that thick, so I use an offset board. So I've got my 3 books lined up. You can do that. If you've got a smaller press, then just do one at a time, obviously, but that works. Okay. And then it's really simple. You just sort of crank the handle down, and this lowers the big if it doesn't get caught on things. So I made my book press. It's a little bit janky, but it was way cheaper than buying it because my roommates at the time had some random plywood lying around, so all I had to do was buy the hardware. And then you basically just press it. You want it pressing down with some amount of force, but you don't want to like crank it really down because then you're just smushing the book unnecessarily. So you want the book to be compressed just a little bit. If you don't have a book press and you don't want to buy one because those things cost a couple $100 each for like a small one, unless you've managed to get lucky and find like an antique version somewhere, you can so there's other options. If you've got just a couple of like reasonably thick, like maybe not necessarily as thick as my offset boards, but pretty close, sturdy wood and like woodworkers clamps, you can kind of cobble together a press. If you check my blog, I think I've got a couple pictures of a cobbled together press because I used that before I made my nice press. That will also function for as a replacement for this kind of press, although again this one's pretty cheap and easy to make. So like I said, if you don't have that, you can use the clamps and the boards, or failing that, a few heavy books and a nice solid floor will work just fine. Whoops, I keep kicking the tripod. Will work reasonably okay. So you've got options. You don't have to immediately go out and buy a whole bunch of fancy bookbinding equipment to get started bookbinding. In fact, I suggest you give it a try first, see if you like it, and then go start upgrading your equipment. Okay, good. I finished a little bit early. So basically once that's dry, you're done. Like that's the end of the book. It's dry, you take it out, check it over, make sure everything looks okay. Like I said, trim any pages you need, but that's basically done at that point. Wrapped fire bricks work. Yeah, so pretty much anything heavy will produce enough compression to work just fine. Questions? I think we have just enough time. I can show you how to make the book cloth that I use out of cotton quilting fabric. But I will pause for a second for questions and drink some more caffeine. All right, I don't see any questions, so again, if you have them, please type them in, but I will go ahead and move on. All right, so how do you make the cotton book cloth? It's really actually pretty simple. You do need a couple of things. You need, again, mulberry paper, wrong thing, that one. I've got my primary camera reversed so that I am not trying to work in a mirror, but unfortunately that means you can't read stuff there. So, it's called rice paper or mulberry paper. You can find it at like the fancy arts and crafts stores, not Joann's, Michael's, Hobby Lobby, but like your local art store for like students. Or you can find it online. There's a few booksellers that make it. And you're gonna need a piece of glass. I got mine from IKEA, just a glass shelf. This is not going to fit on my workspace very well. I'll make it fit. Hold on. So technically, really, you should like clean it in between each one, but I didn't have a chance to clean it in between the book cloth I was making last night and demonstrating it this morning, so it will be okay. You're also going to need, where did I put it? I had it. Where'd it go? Sorry, I temporarily misplaced my cotton. Ah, there it is. So, you're also going to need your cotton. This particular one has a very clear front side and back side, which I figured might be helpful. So, you lay your cotton down, face down on the glass. And then I cut my paper. So there's a rough side. I don't think you can see this very well, and a smooth side. You're going to be putting the glue on the rough side. I find it helpful to have a scrap piece of cardboard to use for applying the glue. For this purpose, and pretty much only this purpose, I use the PVA book glue. I find it's much, much easier than the slightly lumpy wheat starch glue. And you do not want lumpy for this, but it's your choice. In theory, the wheat starch glue can be made to be much smoother. I haven't managed it yet. You're supposed to microwave it like 3 times or something, and every time I try to do that, it just spills everywhere into my microwave and I lose almost all of it. So I just microwave it twice and call it a day. It works well enough as glue. So pretty much what you're doing is you're just gonna brush with a brush a thin layer of glue onto your paper. I suspect that whenever I get the like shiny bleed through glue spots, what I've actually done is gotten slightly too thick a glue layer in that spot. But I haven't done the like scientific testing to prove it or not. So that's just my theory. So you want to brush very lightly because this paper will tear fairly easily. You don't want to brush over the same spot too many times for the same reason, but I'm not very good at getting a nice, smooth. There's a reason I'm not a painter. Like, the illuminations I do are very small, so I don't have to worry about covering a large area very evenly, because I'm terrible at it. But that's okay. I do well enough to make book cloth. So anything that's a kind of a loose weave, like quilting cotton or linen, you would need to back it, because again, the whole idea is that you want If it's going to get stuck to anything, you'd rather it get stuck to the glass because you can peel it off the glass really easily. You would rather the glue not seep through and stick your book to the press. If in doubt about how well your book cloth can stand up to not seeping glue through it, you can always wrap your book in parchment paper before you put it in the press, but I feel that's a waste of parchment paper, especially if you're doing a larger book. So if I'm in doubt, I test it before I use it, and then if I need to, I back it. So like the silk velvet I tested before I used it as book cloth without backing it to make sure that any glue would not leak through. All right. Questions? Is everything making sense so far? Does the book seem easy enough to make? And you're, geared up and want to try making your own at home? If you do, let me know how it goes. I'm happy to help try and answer questions if you run into problems. And I'm excited about this. I want to know if people are trying it too. So far, I'm the only one that I know of that makes books like this, but I would love to meet other people who do. And then I don't go quite all the way out to the edges because I cut the paper larger than the cloth. That also helps a little bit with peeling it off the glass when you're done. Oh, that's awesome! So you're just getting into doing the end band. Yeah, the end band is the most tedious, difficult part. Okay, so I've covered this entire thing with a thin layer of glue. And then I usually don't do this on my workspace. I usually do this on the floor because I have more space, but this way I can show you. All right, so I've got my cotton on here. There's glass on all sides. Then I gently pick up my paper and try to make sure it doesn't accidentally stick to itself, because that wouldn't be great. And then just sort of roughly line it up over top. Smooth it. I tend to smooth kind of from the inside out first, to help make sure there's no like bubbles or lumps of looped paper that's going to do some funny things. And then I take my brayer and I smooth it down a little bit more. If you don't have a glass sheet lying around, you can use your window. I've heard the tutorial I found for making book cloth said you could do that. I haven't tried it. Mostly because this is super easy to clean. I just sort of stick it in my bathtub and let it soak in water for like a couple of minutes, and then I can just easily scrape everything that gets left behind off. And then if I feel like there's anywhere that didn't quite smooth down with the brayer, I've got the bone folder for that. And just sort of do a quick check that everything kind of smoothed out. And then you just set it aside, let it dry. It doesn't matter if it just sort of curls up a little bit, that's fine. So this is one I did last night, so it's dry now. Let's not knock the tea off the table. So just sort of peel it off. Sometimes it comes off nice and easy because it's glass, and glass doesn't really let things stick to it very well. And sometimes it doesn't, and you get little like random residue pieces. Like I said, glass is very easy to clean. Acrylic works too. Yeah, I find glass a little easier to clean when you're done with it. And then you've made book cloth. And then you could, if you want to, trim the excess paper off before you use it. Since we're going to just be trimming extra cloth off too, I tend not to bother. But book cloth. And the great thing is you can find any pretty cloth you want and make a book out of it. as opposed to being limited to the usually plain or like geometric designs for book cloth if you were to buy it. All right. I think that was everything I was going to cover. Book from beginning to end over the course of 3 classes. So, questions? Was it fun? Exciting? I am planning on doing a workshop. I've had a couple of people express interest in that. So I'm trying to figure out, again, because there's, as you saw, there's like a bunch of stages at the end where you do something for 10 minutes and then you let it dry for 6 hours, or however long it takes for glue to dry where you are. So I'm trying to figure out the best way of doing all of that. But yeah, so email me. Oh yeah, let me give you my email again if you don't already have it. Email me if you're interested in the workshop, and I've put together a list of supplies. I just need to think through it, make sure I put everything on there. And then for some of the like specialty supplies, since you can really only buy them in bulk, I can ship them to you for a few dollars and whatever shipping costs these days. So if that's something you're interested in, once I send you the list of supplies, you can let me know which ones you are going to have issues getting, and I can just send them to you. So yeah, feel free to email me any questions. If you do make a book, please do let me know. I'm excited to see what you come up with. Also, my blog, if you haven't already seen it. I do what's called diverse arts. So I do cooking, I do brewing, I got into cordial making recently, I do bookmaking now, I do illumination, so my blog is a little bit of everything. And if you've got questions on any of those things, or any of them sound cool and you want more information, hit me up or ask a question on the blog and I'll get back to you. But yes, thank you all for coming. And I actually managed to finish this class on time, despite the fiasco with the tea, so yay. Sorry if I went super fast. I am glad that you were enjoying my classes. I've taught 2 classes before this series at a university on brewing. And for those of you who live in Atlantia, I've pitched doing this class again for Atlantean University in June. So if you've got any friends who weren't able to tune in this time, they're welcome to tune in next time. So yeah, any last questions? Oh, suggestions for trimming. So for trimming the book, I think this was a question asked a little while ago. I apologize if I didn't see it then. It kind of just depends on what I'm doing. What kingdom do I live in? I will get back to trimming real quick. So I'm currently in Kaid. I moved here about 2 months ago, which was just in time to start quarantine, so I don't really know anybody out here. I came from Atlantia, so I still kind of play virtually in that kingdom. All right, so suggestions for trimming. It depends. I find the rotary cutters a little bit difficult when you're working that close to the book, so I tend to use scissors for that. But I prefer the rotary cutter for most things, but that's one instance where I kind of end up having to use scissors. Any other questions that I may have missed? I'm sorry. I wasn't paying attention to my mini moderator who was making sure I answer questions. All right, well, thank you all for tuning in. If I end up doing any more classes, I will post them to Facebook, and you can probably find them on the Twitch stream. And I will get the recording for this class up sometime in the next day or so, somewhere, hopefully YouTube. I haven't entirely figured out why YouTube won't let me upload the first video, but I'll figure it out. So, again, thank you all, and have a great weekend.